Social characteristics of autism spectrum disorder. We're going to start with poorly developed social skills. Avoids eye contact, does not show facial expressions, few or no gestures used, does not notice other children, does not pretend, does not interact with other children. Now, the classrooms that I have observed have been 8th grade or higher, so 8th grade or high school. So we can go ahead and rule out that I have not seen does not pretend. That's traditionally something that's done on the elementary school level. It's not something that I frequently see in my own classroom. Now, in regards to actually writing, I did teach an English class, so when I would ask students to write fiction, you could say, in a sense, they did pretend. And some pretended more than others, meaning it was a lot easier for some to make up a story than it was for others. Often if I asked for a fictional story and a student can come up with something, they would tell me something that happened in their real life, and then we would kind of make a story based off of that. Avoids eye contact. Now, what's interesting about this one is we're living in a time where we recently had a pandemic. I still think we could be considered to be in it. And a lot of my students, not only do they wear masks, but they also wear hoods, because hoods and hats are okay at our school. So not only do I think that those students avoided eye contact with me, but it was a lot easier for them to do because they were hiding underneath these hoods and masks. So I think I saw less eye contact than I normally would in a non-pandemic setting. Does not show facial expressions. Once again, the majority of my students still wore masks when we were back to school this past year. So I didn't see a ton of facial expressions. It is interesting though, because I had one student who would speak to me frequently about being excited about things or being angry about things, but he always spoke in the same monotone voice, and he always spoke without facial expressions. Few or no gestures used. I am a person who uses my hands frequently to talk. Maybe you've seen that already in the video. So I am big on watching this. I have many students who have shown very little hand gestures. They use their words, and they use their words pretty infrequently. Does not notice other children. What's interesting about this one is on the middle school level, I might invite the students, today, do we want to work in groups of 2? Do we want to work in groups of 4? Or do we want to work alone? And often I would give my students these options to see how they were feeling. If some wanted to work in groups, some could work in groups. If some wanted to work alone, some could work alone. A lot of times my students with autism spectrum disorder would choose to work alone. Okay, and then does not interact with other children. On the middle school level, this is really hard because students are trying to figure out who they are and what's going on in their life. It's already a hard age. But then throw on top of it that they might have insecurities or might have their own boundaries and different things of that nature. And so I really didn't see a whole lot of interaction with students in my classroom. There was some, but not as much as I would have liked. And you can also say that quite possibly because these kids were home for 1.5 years here in California, it could have been because of that as well, based on the pandemic. Okay, difficulty with expressive and receptive communication. So the list is: does not notice when others are hurt or upset, does not share interests, yet has obsessive interests, tends to communicate more to ask a question or protest than be social, difficulty in formulation thoughts and expressing them correctly, and difficulty with pronunciation in tone and facial expressions. Okay, so what did I see? What I saw was that many of my students did have common interests, and they would share them with me. So that was a step for them. But yet they would not share these interests with their peers. So, a student might come up to me and say, "Oh, Mrs. Snyder, I love playing Uno." And I'd be like, "Oh, that's great. So does this other student. Why don't you go talk to them about it? Maybe I could give you guys a deck of cards and you could play Uno." "Oh, no, no. I'm okay, but do you want to play Uno?" And so it's so funny because they have these interests, these obsessive interests, things that they are very much drawn to and driven by, yet they don't share these interests with their peers, even though even though their peers might have very similar interests. Does not notice when others are hurt or upset. That was a hard one in my classroom. It was really hard for these students on the spectrum to realize how they were affecting other people with their words or with their, it was mainly with their words, the way they would say things or being very direct about their feelings. They would often hurt or make somebody upset and not realize it when they did it. Tends to communicate more, to ask a question or protest than be social. Absolutely. Absolutely. I would see questions all day long. Questions about routines, questions about their interests, questions about our routine for the next day. At the end of the year, the 8th graders got to go to Knott's Berry Farm, and I had one student who would repetitively ask me, "When are we going?" And I would say, "The last day of school, June 7th. "But Mrs. Snyder, when are we going?" "So we are a week away from it, June 7th, last day of school." And it's funny because it was his interest, it was his fixation, he was stuck on it, he would continually ask me when he was going to be able to be at Knott's Berry Farm. Difficulty in formulation of thoughts and expressing them correctly. So I had a student that would often be able to think, and you could tell his mind was going, but it was hard for him to get them out, to get these words out, to get these thoughts out into words. And a lot of other students would get very impatient with him. And I learned that I needed to set the tone in the environment. Like, we all know that we're going to wait for this student to say what he's got to say because he's got a lot going on in his mind and he knows exactly what he wants to say. He just has a hard time getting those words out correctly. Tone and facial expressions, difficulty with pronunciation. I had a lot of students that would talk in a monotone voice, whether they were happy, whether they were sad. And it was easy for me to understand them because I got to know them. But for their peers to understand them was a completely different thing. We're going to move on to restrictive and repetitive behaviors. So the list of things are lining up objects and gets upset if order is changed, repeats words and phrases over and over, gets upset by minor changes, must follow certain routines, flap hands, rocks body. So let's talk about these things. Lines up objects and gets upset if order is changed. Now we don't see that too much in the secondary level. We mainly see that in the elementary level. So I didn't see too much of this, but that is also because I knew that my students were affected by this. So I didn't change my classroom around. I did not move the pencils or the markers or the crayons. Everything stayed the same way all year so that my students knew where everything was and where they could get things from. Repeated words and phrases over and over. So once again, we just talked about having an obsessive interest. And so we would see that that obsessive interest repeated in words and phrases over and over. Once again, with the Knott's Berry Farm, when am I going? What am I going to do there? When am I going? Just over and over and over. Gets upset by minor changes. So we did have a routine in my classroom of journal writing. If the journal writing was not done that day, I had a million questions as to why we did not do it. Another thing, I'm sorry, that's for following certain routines. So journal writing at the beginning of class, that's following the routine that was set up every single day. My students they had to do their journal. And if they didn't, there were questions. Gets upset by minor changes. Now that is something that I really tried to avoid in my classroom. Like I said, I did not move these supplies. They always stayed in the same place. Another thing that I did not do very frequently is I did not change seats. I realized how important it is for the students to know that when they come in, they sit at a certain spot, that's their space, and they enjoy being in their own space. If I knew that I was going to have to change seats, that discussion would happen outside my classroom door before we ever walked in. And then when the students came in, there would be name tags on their seats so that they would know where they were going, and they knew that they were going to a new seat before they even walked in. Hand flaps and body rocks. I saw body rocks all year long. Not so much hand flaps. I think I might have observed that more when I would watch the mild to moderate class as they walked around campus and whatnot. But in my classroom, I did see a lot of body rocking. Okay, sitting in their seat, rocking back and forth, tapping pencils, might be considered hand flaps because they're doing a motion with their hands, but I would see a lot of body rocking. And it's interesting to me because as a mother of 3 babies, I still stand in front of my classroom and do body swaying. So I understand how when we get in a zone, we automatically do things that quite possibly we don't realize we're doing. So yes, I tend to stand in front of my classroom and sway. So I can understand how that body rocking can be soothing to their mind and to their soul as they're sitting in a classroom, probably getting antsy from sitting there doing work. These are the social behaviors that I have observed in my classroom.